Adriana Brownlee became the youngest woman to climb all 14 8,000 stairs just at an age of 23. Soon after breaking this record, she asked for regulation for new climber. But in my opinion, if these regulations were already in place, she would not have this record in her name. After accomplishing their goal, it is very common for celebrity climber to call for regulation for new climber. But what exactly is this regulation? There are many regulations in demand, but the most common one is the eligibility criteria for climbing the big mountain like Mount Everest. You must fulfill these criteria before you are allowed to climb Mount Everest. Ideally, you should have some form of experience of climbing peaks in Himalaya and Karakoram. Ideally, you should start with 6,000 peak in Himalaya and Karakoram. Then you should move to the very high altitude and climb some 7,000 peak. Then you should move to the 8,000 peak, some easier one like Cho Oyu, Shishapanagma or Manasulu. Then only you should be allowed to climb Mount Everest. This is the framework of regulation they are demanding for new climber. This is the very common practice in China. If you want to climb Mount Everest from the north side, the Tibetan side, you must have climbed at least one 8,000 peak in advance before Chinese government allow you to permit to climb Mount Everest. However, it is not the case with the Nepalese government. There is no such criteria. If you want to climb Mount Everest from the Nepalese side, you just need to pay for the permit and you are allowed to do this without any prior experience. It is one of the reasons why climbing Mount Everest from the Nepalese side is far more popular than the Chinese side. At first, it looked very sensible to go through all these steps before you are allowed to climb Mount Everest. But if you look at the record of climbing Mount Everest, it does not seem to fit the narrative. Adriana Brownlee, who is asking for regulation for new climber, she didn't went through all these steps before climbing Mount Everest. In fact, Mount Everest was her first Himalayan peak. Before that, she did not have any experience of climbing peaks in Himalaya and Karakoram. She climbed the mountain like Aconcagua, Kilimanjaro and Mount Elbrus before climbing Mount Everest. Nirmal Purja, who shocked the world in 2019 by climbing 14 8,000 peak in just 6 months. He didn't even went through all these steps before climbing the big peaks like Mount Everest or Mountain Dholagiri. He started his mountaineering career with Mount Labuche East, which is more like an acclimatization peak for the climber who are climbing Mount Everest. Then he moved directly to the 8,000 meter peak, Mount Dholagiri, which is far more difficult than the Mount Everest. Then he climbed Mount Everest and rest of 14 8,000 peaks. Grace Sheng, who is on her mission to become first Taiwanese woman to climb all 14 8,000 meters, she started her career with the big mountains like K2 and Everest. She didn't have prior mountaineering experience either, but she did perfectly well in these mountains. Ryan Mitchell, a YouTuber with 1.8 million subscribers, suddenly decided to change his life and climb Mount Everest. With enough motivation and training, he was able to climb Mount Everest just at an age of 19. Like any other climber on this list, Ryan Mitchell didn't have any prior experience of mountaineering. Yet he did fantastically well on his climb to the Mount Everest. Even the most Sherpa guide who work on Everest and these big mountains do not go through all these steps of climbing 6,000 and 7,000 and then only they will try 8,000 peak. The most notable example of this would be the Nimma Rinji Sherpa, who is the youngest mountaineer to climb all 14 8,000. He started his mountaineering career with Manasulu, which he climbed in 2022. From there, he climbed the rest of 14 8,000 and became the youngest mountaineer to climb all these peaks just at an age of 14. But how is it possible for inexperienced climber to climb big mountain like Mount Everest? It depends on the climbing style. A mountain in Himalaya and Karakoram can be climbed in alpine or expedition style. Alpine style is far more popular in the Western countries, but in Himalaya and Karakoram, expedition style dominate. In the alpine style, you work in a small team. You are responsible for your own route fixing, navigation, pitching your own tent, and your own safety. There is no guide. This is exactly the reason alpine style is difficult and considered more dangerous. It requires a lot of experience. If somebody is climbing in alpine style, it totally makes sense to go through all these steps of climbing 6,000, 7,000 and easier 8,000. But in the expedition style, you get lots of support. There are Sherpa to do things for you. You don't even have to carry your own backpack, sleeping bag or tent. Rope is fixed from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain by the Sherpa. There is no chance of getting lost, and if you feel tired, you can utilize oxygen cylinder. The biggest advantage these expedition operators have is the usage of oxygen cylinder. It is one of the most important reasons why so many inexperienced people are able to climb Mount Everest. So far, Mount Everest has been summited 8,000 times, but only 200 people have not utilized supplementary oxygen. It is not easy to climb Mount Everest. You have to endure the extreme cold, find your way through the treacherous Khumbu icefall, and climb the steep section of the Mount Everest to reach the summit. The most difficult part of climbing Mount Everest is to breathe in the thin air. The lack of oxygen in the atmosphere makes it really difficult for most people to climb Mount Everest. But when you utilize supplementary oxygen, altitude stops right there. It basically defies the purpose of climbing mountain in Himalaya. In the recent year, it has become really common for climbers to utilize supplementary oxygen. Some climbers utilize oxygen cylinder right from the base camp to the summit. Climbing Mount Everest with supplementary oxygen is not the true way of climbing, but it makes possible for many inexperienced people to climb Mount Everest. It's totally a different game when you are on supplementary oxygen. Another regulation in demand is to limit the number of permits issued by the Nepalese government. This is in response to the viral social media post where hundreds of climbers were lined up till the summit of the Mount Everest. These big companies have their contact in the government. When Nepali government will limit the number of permits, these big companies will get the permit first. The small companies and independent climbers will suffer and they may not even get a permit. I'm personally not against the limiting the number of permits in the Mount Everest, but how about limiting the number of clients by each tour operator? I bet they won't agree on that. Another regulation in demand is to mandatory use of IFMGA guide. Not everyone can hire IFMGA guide. Those small companies rely on the local guide. Local guide may be equally capable of dealing with the situation like IFMGA guide. Becoming IFMGA guide is an expensive and lengthy process, and the local people from Nepal may not able to afford that. Another regulation in demand which Nepalese government is going to implement next year is to raise the price for the permit for the Mount Everest. As of 2024, a climber will have to pay $12,000 for the permit of Mount Everest. From the next year, 2025, Nepalese government is planning to make it to $15,000. It is not going to change anything. It will only affect the small tour operator and independent climber. The big companies and big clients will pay any amount of money to climb the Mount Everest. These big clients are already paying $500,000 for their expedition today. Hike of $3,000 in permit won't affect their business. Even with the hike in the permit fee, the Mount Everest will remain crowded. Adriana Brownlee, who asked for regulation in the Mount Everest, runs an expedition company called AGA Expedition with a strong Gelji Sherpa. These regulations will only benefit big tour operators. What will work? If we can end this craze, we must understand climbing Mount Everest is no longer an extraordinary task. Anyone with enough money and motivation can climb Mount Everest. Climbing Mount Everest today is not same as climbing Mount Everest 20 years ago. Today climbers utilize lots of support and modern gears which make their life easy in the mountain and defies the purpose of high altitude climbing. Today it is very common for climbers to hire more than one Sherpa. The most notable example would be the Grace Chang. Grace Chang on her mission to K2 hired 7 Sherpa to carry her from the base camp to the summit. We must stop worshipping these celebrity climbers. Whenever they post something about their accomplishment in the social media, we must ask how much support did they use, how many Sherpa they hired. If they didn't do it by themselves, it's not a great achievement. It's not about what mountain they climb, it's about how they climb. I personally know many Everesters who cannot even climb 6,000 or 7,000 in the Himalaya. They don't know how to navigate, they don't know how to fix the rope, they don't know how to camp in the safe places, they don't understand the avalanche risk and mitigation. Yet they hold the title of Everester. This is the reality of climbing in the Himalaya. There are people in the Himalaya who are climbing 6,000 and 7,000. They are doing way more difficult job than these Everesters. These celebrity climbers are hungry of attention. If we can stop this craze, we might see the smaller lines at the summit of Mount Everest.